And then for our next speaker, also from a security company, we had someone from F-Secure a couple of months ago in the, I think the February edition. Yeah, that was a great talk. And now via one of our friends in the Netherlands from the University of Delft, she suggested asking you as a speaker. So here you are, not per se talking about security, but at least somewhat related to it.
Well, I think everything is nowadays related to security, in a way. Can you hear me?
Yeah, the people at home can now hear you.
Okay, so it's for that. So I've worked for F-Secure for 2 months. I'm not trying to talk to you about F-Secure in any way, or I'm not trying to talk to you about security, but since pretty much everything nowadays is connected, and the stuff that I really talk about is quality and feedback and knowing about things, security is just, one of the things that I tend to often look at. I also look at functionality, like the functionality that should be there, not just the negative side of it. I look at performance, I look at various use cases, all sorts of things. So I'm a tester by profession. That's what I do. That's what I've done for the last 20 years. And I wanted to share for about 20 minutes today with you some ideas about how testing happens, and in a very specific setting. Sure. It's off.
It's having some disturbance.
Okay.
Say something again.
Switch the mic.
All right.
Do you mind holding?
No. Fine. Give that to you. All right. So, talking about exploratory testing and API, because again, the way I understood this session is that you're kind of looking at things a bit more from a technical perspective. So I wanted to kind of approach this from that angle. About a year ago, I was asked to do a session in a conference called Agile Alliance Technical Conference. And that's again a technical session and a technical conference. And people knew that I'm a tester and I do things around exploratory testing. And I had to think about what would I take to that conference, and this is kind of like a summary of that kind of a thing. So I decided that a thing that I want to show to people is that you can apply exploratory testing not just on graphical user interfaces, which is something that a lot of people do and show, but also on APIs. And the API that I started to look into is, well, the first ones that I kind of saw were all kinds of REST APIs, things that could be commonly used, but then I wanted to actually go even deeper into an API that is very close to code, and I went to a testing framework called approval tests. Anyone ever seen this except Llewellyn, who is going to be talking to you in the end of the day today? No? Approval tests, it's basically a unit testing framework. If I would consider myself, as I often do, a tester who doesn't write so much code, I do read a lot of code, but I don't write so much code, I might find it a bit intimidating that this looks very much like code. But the thing that I was trying to kind of show to the people who are approaching APIs with exploratory testing ideas is that when you have an IDE, it actually is a user interface. It just looks different. You can approach it in the exact same way. When you go into, this is from Visual Studio, if you go and open the verify and kind of like delete most of the stuff so that you can see the options, you can see what kind of things you can put there. And similarly, you can change things on top, like all the different bits and pieces that are exposed of your API. You can go and play with them, and that's basically the idea of exploratory testing an API. But the ways you play with it are that you think of all kinds of perspectives. This is a very small picture, and I'm not imagining that you will see what happens there. This is a result of about 1 hour of playing in one conference about a month ago. All the red things, bright red things, are problems that people found. All the blue things are questions that people would like to ask about the API. And all the different branches here, they are aspects of the API that people were exploring and finding ideas on. different things that you could approach. Just to look at this in a bit more detail. When I was first exploring this API, I went to the developer, which happens to be Llewellyn back there, and I asked him, what does it do? With a bit of interviewing, and he's a very nice person kind of volunteering information, I learned that there's two APIs there. There's a thing called approvers. They do all these kind of things. A brilliant requirements list in that sense that I could test against. I also learned that the reporters do very different things. Again, a brilliant list of requirements. There's many of each of these. So in exploration, I might want to figure out which ones are covered by which of the reporters, which ones are not. And all of this kind of led to the ideas that we could improve documentation, we could improve the discoverability of the API, we could improve the way new users are introduced to this, and even to functional bugs related to how the thing would work in different kinds of settings. The functional bugs in particular that I ran into were related to environments. So what I typically do when I explore is I draw some kind of a map. There's the thing somewhere in the middle that I was supposed to be testing, the approval tests, but it lies on top of an IDE. It's delivered into that environment by certain means. There's various languages this is written on. They might need to be consistent amongst each other. There's documentation, all kinds of diff tools that this uses. And again, whatever you're exploring, there's always an environment that you might need to look into. So all of this from the example really to me is that people tend to look at things differently. I'm a tester, Llewellyn, the creator of that API. He is a developer. And when we look at the exact same thing, we actually don't see the same things. We see different things. Llewellyn had automated a lot of unit tests. He's actually one of the developers that I know that does a lot of testing on whatever code he writes. And still, there were chances for me to find relevant problems, relevant information, relevant things to look at. As a tester, if I look at this picture, well, there's two different perspectives. From one angle, it's a cat. From one angle, it's a bird. But I might also see that it comes out of a set of geometrical shapes. It's been drawn with a pen that is not quite always the same width, but it varies. And there might be intention or accident wherever in all of this. So the idea that I'm talking about to you today is exploratory testing. And exploratory testing really is an approach to testing which is using active thinking, active questioning, and different kind of heuristics as a way of systematically going through different kinds of perspectives. There's requirements, there's risks, there's the code that is the ultimate truth. If it's missing something, it won't do that. There's different kind of stakeholders, whether they mean good or bad things. There's different kinds of expectations. And all of that kind of from various kinds of checklists you're bringing into looking at the product. I can look at the APIs just as well as I can look at end user products. But no matter what I look at as an exploratory tester, it's really, for me, it's kind of like an external imagination. It's as if it was speaking to me. So when I send a message or run the API call once, it might say something back to me, and when I change it just a little bit, whatever way it responds again, it either teaches me that nothing really changed and I need to change my approaches, or it tells me what is the smallest possible change that I need to make in order to actually kind of make a difference in how the product works. I feel that oftentimes that the products kind of like, or the APIs, the things that I look at, they kind of whisper to me. They tell me where the problems are. And all of this kind of comes to this point where there's this almost like serendipity sometimes. Like I touch something and it breaks, but it was always broken. I didn't break it. I was just meticulously going through different kinds of ideas of how could I find the things that the end users would find. So kind of like a fast forward of the end user's perspective. And for a long time, I thought that this is something special, kind of in a tester DNA. But then I worked for 4.5 years. I worked with a team of developers, absolutely wonderful people all in all. We worked very closely together, especially in the last 2 years. We were doing a thing called mob programming. And we were doing some pairing and learning things that way. And I started realizing that when I sit next to a developer and I'm all quiet, all they need to do is look at me, and somehow apparently my face or my presence tells them the exact same things that the product tells me. So they look at me and they say, you'd want me to click here. You'd want me to enter this value here. You'd want me to change this thing here. And I don't need to really say anything. But somehow I'm holding the space for the idea that there's all of these additional ideas that we might be missing when we think we already know what we need to do. And there's all of these unknown unknowns that we kind of need to give chances to. And that's the idea of exploratory testing. On exploratory testing, there's usually 3 ways of scoping it. Meaning, I'm a tester. For me, it's kind of like a lifestyle. So I go to work, and all the testing that I do is really exploratory testing. I think of exploratory testing as if it's testing as a performance. Like I go on a stage, I work with the product, and I do like improvisation. I listen to it, and I pay more attention to things where there's these little whispers of this might be an area of a lot of problems, or this is an area of a lot of relevance. But not everyone approaches it in the same way. Other people usually approach it as a time-boxed activity. Especially developers often think of it as, let's take a couple of hours or half a day, and let's get together all of us and explore. And usually the get-together is very relevant in that sense that having other people around you makes you remember things better. And the third way is what so-called traditional testers, or I would even sometimes call them commodity testers, do. They take test cases, and if they are any good at what they're doing, they don't obey the orders. They don't click exactly what the instructions said, but they go sideways just a little bit, vary the data just a little bit, so that they add to their chances of serendipity, the lucky accident of running into a problem that might be relevant. But all of these different ways, there's even more ways of managing this. So there's a really nice article if you want to look into more ways of managing it. I'm not going to talk about that much today, by a guy called James Lindsay. He's a test strategist from UK, and I think he lists 25 different ways of managing it, and this time boxing and writing detailed notes is just one of the ways. So the whole mind mapping is a way that I use a lot. But all of this kind of leads into the idea that you want people who take occasionally, or even pretty much all the time, the hat of a tester. And it's good to remember that those people, when they're around, they are not there to break the code. They're there to break illusions. And actually every one of us should be that kind of a person that looks for the illusions, looks for the ideas that might be off, might not be quite right, and that needs to be discussed. So testing really is an information providing service, and exploration is a great way of kind of finding the unknown unknowns, unexpected things out there. So kind of to end this with, I find that I've been a tester for 20 years. I've barely started to call myself a programmer in the last 2 years, and I still call myself a non-programming programmer. So if I have other things to do, I tend to often rather pair with somebody else who identifies as a programmer than do that by myself. I think I'm a pretty good tester. I'm a pretty good person listening to the applications. They kind of whisper to me and they give me all these hints. But it's only because I've been spending a lot of time learning to listen. And I find that the ways that I've learned to listen, the ways I've learned to explore, the ways I've learned all about these heuristics and rules of thumb that help you kind of think in multiple different lenses, is that I found very early on in my career, found a tester community that shares on these kind of things. But in the last 2 years, I've started to also see that while the identity has helped me find the community to learn from, the breaking of the barriers so that we actually work together on all roles on these kind of activities is what makes the difference. The skill set is actually very relevant for all of us. So I hope you have some approaches also in your projects in breaking some of the illusions by actual empirical evidence, because that's all that testing is about, showing things that are real in the real life instead of just the imaginary parts. All right, that's kind of my short session today.
Thank you very much. Any questions? Otherwise, I'm going to point at volunteers.
Just ask something. Or comment something. Share an experience of yours. Is anyone doing exploratory testing here? Nobody's confessing.
How do you see the because most of us are like developers or have like a development background and tend to also like automating the testing, making like unit tests and kind of skipping the exploratory testing. How do you see the relation?
I actually think that some of the best developers I know, they approach unit testing in a very exploratory fashion as well. So some developers, usually not the better ones, they kind of think already that they know all the things that are relevant and they miss a lot of things. And the ones that actually are hitting the mark more, they have a lot of more of this exploratory mindset, even to approach the unit tests. But I find that there's this small scale and the larger scale, like thinking, like whether you start from the small pieces or if you start from the value perspective. And you will see different things when you start from the value perspective versus when you start on, I need to build these details first. And it all comes together eventually in the code, because again, like I tried to say here, code is the ultimate truth. If it doesn't do something, then the product won't do that. So a lot of the times the things that we might find are things that we just, we haven't thought about implementing. And the previous talk about security, people like me, people who identify as exploratory testers, complaining about things like that is pretty much every day for us. And it might not be something that comes up in requirements always, like that you need to actually remember to implement this as well. And a lot of times you forget things. So it's kind of like keeping track of what still is needed and what are the risks if that's missing.
Nowadays we try to put a lot of this stuff like testing and security in like the definition of done, so we can just make it part of the daily routine of delivering the software in the teams. If you don't have that covered and like retroactively have to start creating the test, what's your suggestion for convincing like our business stakeholders that this testing is bringing us value, is improving the quality? Do you have any suggestions for that?
I think that developers, even when you don't have like a separate tester, the developers actually do a lot of testing. Sometimes I'm seeing that some of the better testing comes from active developer-oriented groups where there are no testers, or if there is somebody with a testing background, that person has already kind of like also stepped towards the development side. So if for some reason you've never realized that the whole group needs to test in any way, then you're probably seeing some relevant problems in your production. So for example, the company that I joined 4.5 years ago, they had worked without a tester for about 20 years. And they hired me because they had 17.5% of users seeing visible error messages, and they just couldn't figure out where they were coming from. And I spent the first year basically just touching the product, and I couldn't touch it without it breaking. So if you have this kind of information gap, if your managers notice that your users are complaining about something that you just have no clue, then you might want to consider testing.
Final question from the audience. Do you have any questions from the interwebs? Do we have a feed open? Okay. Sorry, internet.
Is disconnected.
All 19 of you. Yeah. Okay. Please give another round of applause for Maaret. We have a beer break now. 10-minute beer break. So please be back at 4:30. Thank you.